So I was asked to speak specifically actually about the issue of the impact on Syria, or the Syrian stance regarding the referendum. So that's what I'm going to focus on in my brief talk. Just to let you know that, yeah, I have, as Ephraim Kaush mentioned, I've worked quite a bit as a journalist in Kurdistan over the last 10 years or so, and I was there actually at the time of the referendum and left a day before the airport closed on September 29th. So if people would like in the questions and answers to ask more about that and so on, of course I'll be happy to try to speak about that more. With regard, however, to the issue of the impact on Syria, or the Syrian response to the referendum, of course we have to, when thinking about Syria, remember that Syria is divided into a number of different factors, and what I want to try to do is consider briefly the response and stance of each of these regarding the issue of the Iraqi-Kurdish referendum. Well, of course, Syria is divided into four: the regime, the remnants of the Sunni Arab rebellion, the Federation of Northern Syria, which is, of course, in fact, the Kurdish-controlled area in the northeast, and the Islamic State. Regarding the Islamic State stance towards the referendum, I won't go into detail. The Islamic State is about to cease to exist as a factor controlling territory in Syria. Of course, there is the race down the Euphrates River Valley right now, with the government forces and the Russians on the western side of the river, the Kurds and the Americans on the east. So IS we won't consider. So what I want to consider is the regime stance, the stance of the rebels, briefly, and then finally the stance of the Kurds, the stance of the Syrian Kurdish Authority in northeast Syria regarding the referendum. First and foremost then to the issue of the Assad regime. Well, you will not be surprised to learn that, of course, the Assad regime was strongly and vociferously opposed to any notion of the referendum and indeed, of course, of Kurdish independence in northern Iraq. I think we can, in understanding the Assad regime's response, we need to divide the issue into two. The first is the close practical relationship of cooperation which has emerged in the course of the last 6 years of civil war in Syria between, first of all, the Iraqi government of Nouri al-Maliki, and since then the government, since 2014, of Prime Minister Abadi. As we are all aware, the key problem facing the Assad regime in its war against the rebellion was that of manpower, namely the lack of loyal manpower, and as is well documented and known, it was the Iranian, first and foremost, mobilization of client militia groups intervening into the Syrian space, which perhaps more than any other single factor saved the day or filled that gap for Assad. Not a few of those militias which came into the Syrian fighting space, so to speak, from 2012 onwards, were Iraqi militias. Some of them have already been mentioned here in the previous talk. Harakat Nujaba, of course, also Kataib Hezbollah have been in there, and many other Iraqi militias. So there's a debt to be paid of practical cooperation and, in a certain sense, of membership of a similar broad regional alliance, that of Iran's friends, between the Assad regime and the Iraqi government, such that, of course, any notion of separation of the country, of Taqsim al-Bilad, of the division of the country, absolutely unacceptable to the Assads. This is one first and obvious angle. The second interesting angle to consider is the long-standing relationship of hostility of Assad regimes, and indeed of Ba'athi regimes preceding the emergence of Hafez al-Assad, with regard to Kurdish aspirations in Syria itself. That is to say, it's not surprising to anybody here to recall, the very, very draconian responses going all the way back to the very early 1960s of Ba'athi regimes in Syria regarding Kurdish separatist aspirations. And we remember the act in 1962 of the simple withdrawal of citizenship from, I think, around 150,000 Syrian Kurds at that time. And these statuses then of native-born Syrian Kurds who did not have citizenship, famously the two different statuses, the ajanib, the foreigners, and then an even more repressed population, maktumi'in, the hidden ones. Kurdish Syrian-born citizens absolutely lacking in any rights of citizenship, even on the most basic level, lacking even, in the case of maktumi'in, lacking even identity cards. and in the case of the Ajanib, lacking passports, rights, and the right to travel. And we remember in 1970, Hafez Assad's decision to create the Arab belt of Arab settlement along the Syrian-Turkish border, with the interesting result for those of us who've worked in Syrian Kurdistan, as I have also quite a bit over recent years, that one comes across again and again towns that have two names, Malkiya, which is also Dirik, and so on and so forth, Ras al-Ain, which is also Serekaniya, Ain al-Arab, which is also Kobani, and so on and so forth. The traditional response then of Assad regime, for ideological as well as practical reasons, the absolute suppression of Kurdish separatism in the Syrian context, reflecting also its stance on Iraq. And lastly, the regime's position, of course, being, well, if the Iraqi Kurds were to become independent, this might give other people ideas. Bashar Assad, famously in recent days, describing these Kurdish cantons in northeast Syria as temporary structures. And I have a quote here from none other than, no lesser figure than Walid Muallim, the Syrian foreign minister, who predictably says, this is quoting in Sana, the official regime news agency, a week ago, "We in Syria recognize a united Iraq and reject any procedure that leads to the fragmentation of Iraq. This step is rejected, we do not recognize it, and yesterday I informed the Iraqi foreign minister of this stance." One of his aides, a man called Ayman Susan, was quoted in Al-Watan the following day, yet more bluntly expressing himself, "The referendum is a product of American policies that aim to fragment the region's countries and create conflict between its parts." So this is the traditional good old language of Syrian and Iraqi Baathism translated into the current context. Thus far with regard to the regime. Remember, however, that in practical terms, the Assad regime's opposition to the referendum is of relatively limited impact because, of course, the regime currently does not control any of the areas bordering Iraqi Kurdistan. They control areas now close to the border with Iraq, but these areas are still further to the south. The borders of Iraqi Kurdistan with Syria are entirely controlled by the Syrian Kurdish authorities. So the regime is to some degree, geographically at least, isolated from this area. Secondly, with regard to the rebels. First of all, with regards to the rebels, it's vital to remember the same thing, that geographically speaking, what remains of the Syrian Arab rebellion's control on the ground is a very long way away from Iraqi Kurdistan and indeed from the Iraqi border. The Syrian rebellion remains strong in essentially in two areas of Syria. One is in northwest Syria in Idlib province, the other is in southwest Syria in Quneitra and Dara provinces adjoining the borders of Israel and Jordan. The rebellion is a long, long way away from Iraqi Kurdistan. There is one remaining area or stronghold of the rebellion close to the Iraqi border, the American-supported base in Al-Tanif, but this is much further south, facing Anbar province, southern Anbar province, not facing the Kurdish area. So the rebels are not relevant so much to the discussion. But to conclude with regard to their stance, again, no surprise. Taqsim al-Bilad, the issue of division of the homeland, is something which they have been absolutely opposed to with regard to Syria since the beginning. It reflects the very great suspicion the Syrian rebels had from the very start regarding the independent Kurdish organization in the northeast of Syria, and this stance reflects itself also with regard to any notion of the division of Iraq, and therefore staunch opposition from Syrian opposition circles to the Iraqi Kurdish independence referendum. Lastly, and most interestingly, the issue of the response of the Syrian Kurdish Authority to the Iraqi Kurdish referendum. Not in any way as simple as a casual observer might assume. A casual observer would assume, in the casual observer's naivete, that a neighboring Kurdish national authority ought to be entirely behind a sister authority approaching the possibility of sovereignty. But this casual observer would need to take a lesson in Kurdish politics, and most specifically a lesson in the very, very deep, not only rivalry is not a strong enough word, sometimes even approaching mutual hatred between, or certainly deep-rooted animosity between the two Kurdish political traditions of Kurdish Democratic Party of Masoud Barzani, of course, in Iraqi Kurdistan, and the PKK. And I say PKK and not PYD because it is important to understand that the Syrian Kurdish Authority, as created in northeast Syria, is the product and creation of the PKK tradition in Kurdish politics, not of a separate Syrian trend. The animosity between PKK and KDP is deep. There has been correspondingly a deep suspicion and skepticism towards the ability of the Barzanis to deliver successful move towards independence coming from those PKK circles. Corresponding to that also, of course, from this PKK ideology, interestingly, is the hostility towards the notion of ethnic national self-determination. Now, this might sound odd and counterintuitive to us. How can it be that a nationalist movement like PKK is opposed to the creation of ethnic nation states? Those of us who've spent some time around those circles know they take their ideology very seriously indeed. And from their point of view, from the point of view of this PKK ideology, the idea of separatism, ethnic national states and so on is something which they are critical of. They're particularly keen politically now to be critical of it, because of course the Syrian Kurdish entity in Syrian Kurdistan is in a process of expecting to soon have to begin a negotiation for its future with the Syrian regime on the basis of federalism and the attempt to preserve some kind of autonomy within regime-dominated Syria. So the last thing they want is to be coming out for separatism and creation of states. Therefore, at least what I have observed as a close observer, I think, of these circles, is a distinct gap between the public stance and what you can hear privately from those circles. Publicly, the leadership of Rojava of Syrian Kurdistan, Federation of Northern Syria, were supportive, cautiously, of the referendum. They were in favor of it, and a number of leaders made statements along the lines of, we hope in Syria we won't reach this same situation where such a declaration becomes necessary. If in Iraq they have, then they were guardedly supportive of the referendum initiative. Privately, there was criticism, and there has been extremely harsh criticism from PKK circles, publicly and privately, in fact, since the entry of Iraqi forces into Kirkuk. The criticism has focused on what they see as the very poor preparation of the Barzanis, the non-serious preparation of the Barzanis for what might have happened after the referendum in a number of areas. Firstly, most obviously, in terms of military organization, as they see it, the failure to invest since 2003 sufficiently in the military area. Secondly, the failure to prepare the political ground, enabling the Iranians to pull off this very impressive coup, of taking the Talibanis out of the picture in Kirkuk, and thus almost avoiding bloodshed in the taking of Kirkuk, which, as we know, with one stroke, reduces Iraqi Kurdish oil production by 50%, kills the possibility of Iraqi Kurdish state with one blow. The failure to prepare politically, and thirdly, criticism from the PKK people with regard to the economic issue, the enormous debt of around $20 billion of KRG, the corruption, the failure to pay salaries to public sector workers, and therefore the notion that is this an entity ready for statehood? Perhaps not. So from PKK circles, very strong criticism. At the same time, I can tell you what I heard from somebody not top-ranking, but mid-ranking in those circles, which said that had the Iraqi forces, after capturing Alton Kupri last week, had they carried on from Kirkuk province into Erbil province, they were only 40 kilometers from Erbil, there would at that point have been a mobilization of PKK fighters from Kandil, as there was in 2014 to stop the advance of ISIS. That's to say, an interesting contrast between the very, very great and even bitter political rivalry between these camps, and nevertheless the notable ability, which we saw in 2014, to organize militarily when the issue reaches one of complete crisis, and at that point cooperate with a considerable and interesting degree of success. So just to sum up then, I suppose, the issue, if we go back to look at our Syrian context in the four areas, well, ISIS, as we said, of course, is absolutely opposed by its very nature to any division of Muslim land, so was opposed to referendum. ISIS doesn't matter, as ISIS is no longer, or almost is no longer a force controlling ground in Syria. Abu Kamal the foot of the Euphrates is likely to fall either to the government or to the Kurdish forces within the next couple of months, and then ISIS as a territorial entity in Syria will be done with. The Assad regime, as I said, absolutely in alliance with the government of Iraq and specifically with the Shia militias to whom it owes a great deal and therefore opposed to the referendum. The rebels opposed from their own point of view. And the Syrian Kurds, to conclude on this, by no means as supportive as one might imagine. And on this I'll conclude. The absence of Kurdish unity and the failure of Kurdish movements, regardless of the animosity they may have between them, to have come together into anything resembling a single national framework, a framework of a single national movement, remains for many of us who work closely with the Kurds one of the most frustrating elements. What's frustrating about it is that the Kurds themselves are aware of it too. They are aware of how it limits them. They are aware of how it enables other forces to manipulate them. And in October in Kirkuk, with the Iranian manipulation of PUK, we witnessed an example of this which will be remembered to history, an example of it on a historic level. And yet, despite this awareness, one finds there seems to be a very deep and built-in inability of the Kurds to work together, except, as I said, when it comes to absolute military crisis, at which, in a way equally frustratingly, they suddenly develop the ability to work together for a limited period of time until they can get back to political animosity and infighting once again. Until that pattern is broken, I think we'll be waiting to see the emergence of Kurdish sovereignty for some years to come. Thank you.